and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Kent Lambert, a Chicago-based musician and media artist who's also the Assistant Director of the Hack Arts Lab Media Arts Data and Design Center at the University of Chicago. We will discuss his artistic practice and how it reflects his experience of intellectual property, especially copyright. So welcome to the show, Kent.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad to have you. It was really fun running into you in Chicago at the Chicago Underground Film Festival, and I'm glad we made a tentative appointment to have a conversation because, as you know, I've always been a big fan of your videos and of your music and also of your perspective on artistic practice, especially in relation to appropriation and ownership.
Well, great. Yeah, I was glad to know about your podcast. And as I mentioned, before we started this, I haven't listened to it yet because I didn't want to get self-conscious. But now that we're doing it, I'm really excited to dig in and kind of catch up to how your sort of identity in life as a professor in this space. And I appreciate you bringing me on because I know I don't quite fit the mold of your typical guest, but I hope that I can say some things of value to your listenership.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I do try to break the mold, such as it is, whenever possible. So Ken, in sort of by way of introducing yourself to listeners who may not all be steeped in media arts and independent music, I wonder if you could kind of sequentially talk a little bit in sort of a general sense for a non-specialist audience, both about the kind of video work that you do, as well as sort of the various musical projects in which you're engaged.
Sure. I mean, to really break it down in terms of, as a teenager, I think once I got steeped in, American pop culture of the 90s, I was most excited about music and really all genres of it. And then I got really into film. And so I tried to be a music major briefly and didn't want to get that deep with it. And that's a whole other story. But I sort of pivoted to go to film school, which seemed like a great kind of compromise because I knew I'd have the ability to maybe collaborate with other students and perhaps score their student films. And so I did a good amount of that in film school. And so I was able to sort of maintain this identity and this practice of making music without studying it formally and getting lost in music theory and music academia. And then it was during film school at the University of Iowa that I was introduced to lots of experimental cinema. The real like lightning strike sort of touchstone moment for me was Martin Arnold's Passage à l'Acte, I think is how you pronounce it, in which do you know that film?
Of course,
yeah. Just making sure. But for your listeners, this film, the filmmaker Martin Arnold takes a very short section of the film version of To Kill a Mockingbird and using optical printing techniques. To me, the way that I describe it to people, because this is how it felt to me as someone very engaged, and I was consuming a lot of sample-based music, and so it felt like he was just sort of scratching on the film. You see moments just get looped and repeated in a way that for a lot of people would probably be quite grating, but to me there was this irreverence to it. It took this sort of old text, not that old, but relatively old at the time, and sort of transformed it into this really strange, kinetic, new experience. And so that and a lot of other work like that, just it felt like it was opening up a new world to me. As I'd made some scripted narrative stuff for film classes, and a lot of my friends were thinking they might try to go to LA and make independent films or get into the industry. And I didn't really enjoy planning and scripting and making films in that mode. And so realizing that it was a valid practice in certain circles to make work completely from other work, it was extremely exciting to me because this is the late 90s. It's just when the technology to, digitize VHS tapes and things like that and edit them on the computer. It was just becoming accessible to universities, and um, you know, before long, I had my own laptop and a capture card and was able to hook up VCRs, and so I could just find material all over the place, thrift stores, going out of business, sales at video stores, yard sales, you name it, and um, you know, I just started to make work out of those materials, and at the same time, I was an avid music listener, and also starting to try to figure out how to record my own music at home. And so listening to lots of music like hip hop and ambient and all kinds of electronic music that also engage with sampling, I think perhaps the way that those two sides sort of came together is that I think I always had this intuitive knack for taking material that, in broad terms would just be perceived as, well, this is just like garbage, and using kind of musical structures or rhythms to tease out some other sort of meaning or experience, or at least allow for the possibility that something that, if you were to watch the entire movie or watch if you were to see it in its original context, maybe it doesn't have much value, or is offensive, or is just unwatchable, as people say. But how can I make this watchable using formal techniques? I didn't necessarily think about it that way at the time, but I've always, in terms of the way that I work with video, I don't necessarily, it's very rare that I map out a plan and, this is the point I'm trying to make, or this is what I think is going to happen. I just see something and think, oh, that's weird, or that's fascinating. And then maybe I have another piece of material and I think, oh, I feel like I could create some chemistry between these two things. And then the sort of quote unquote finished work happens through lots of trial and error and iterating and different editing sequences, and just shifting the clips around and until it feels right to me.
Well, so a lot of your work, or really most of your work that I've seen, uses material that you've found from another source and then changes it or alters it or recontextualizes it in such a way that it means something different from the kind of original intended meaning of the material that you're using. I wonder if you could describe sort of one of your films that you think of as being kind of particularly representative of some of that kind of work, in such a way that viewers who haven't seen it maybe could kind of get a sense of the way you're thinking about how to approach restructuring material and using it to engage in meaning making.
Great, yeah. So the first one that comes to mind, because it's possibly my favorite of all of my videos, is from 10 years ago. It's called Fantasy Suite, and the material that I used for it, and this might get at sort of the sort of haphazard process that leads to these pieces. I had a roommate who, knew that I was making these kinds of videos, and his partner was really into the Bachelor, that TV show, sort of ironically, but she would record it on their VCR because she couldn't watch it whenever it was on. And I went to visit them one time, and there was this one section that the two of them thought that I would really be interested in a couple of clips of the show, because there were some cutaways that they just thought were really strange, and they were right. And so they gave me that tape, and I had it for a few years, and then a few years before that, I had worked for an art house film distributor in New York City, and my job was to go through the unsolicited submissions. So filmmakers hoping for commercial distribution would send their tapes to scads of distributors that existed at the time, and so I would go through these tapes, and almost all of them had no prospects for commercial distribution, so I would write a polite note and send them back. But in a few cases, there would be something that was just like too good for me, and it was not going to be distributed, but there might be something really fascinating or wonderful to me about it. And so, the ethics of this are, a little bit dubious because the filmmakers are sending things with one intention, and then little do they know there's this entry level worker drone who's like, oh, this might be interesting material for my art. But I would sometimes dub these tapes and then keep them. And so this Bachelor material resonated for me with this kind of sincere, but very, by most standards, very badly acted kind of love story independent film. Um, and so I had thought for a good long while, I think I could make some relationship between the content in these two pieces. And then I was also obsessed with Sky Mall. Rest in peace, Sky Mall. I was just obsessed with the way that these technological gadgets would be marketed through images. And so the piece itself cuts between. Oh, and then there was also this 80s movie, this remake of a 1950s movie called Where the Boys Are. And so all of these texts, to me, what they had in common, including Sky Mall, was sort of representing sort of heterosexual, mainstream kind of white romance in particular ways that 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 were worthy of critique, were worthy of unpacking, that were funny if critiqued in a certain way. And so, to describe, I guess, the way that the piece plays to your audience might be tricky. I would say they can watch it because it's totally available on YouTube and Vimeo with no passwords, to block them. But it ends up being this sort of strange, I guess, kind of tone poem that cuts between these different pieces of material, weaving together a sort of ambiguous, strange, but when the piece plays publicly, people always laugh. I think it's clear that I don't know that I'm making fun of, say, the people on The Bachelor, but that I'm trying to get at something about the way we construct love or romance or relationships through culture. And so one of the techniques that I used, this piece, I struggled to make it because I knew that I felt like there was something there. But as I described earlier, this process of not necessarily having a roadmap, but just editing intuitively until it works. There were times when I almost dropped the project altogether because it wasn't clicking. But there was a moment when I slowed down just slightly the audio, or the audio and video of the Bachelor clips, so that the women's voices were made deep enough to almost sound like a man's voice, and so kind of making all of the characters on The Bachelor sort of androgynous. The men would speak and their voices would be even deeper, but it lengthened what they were saying, and with certain, I don't know, subtle inflections, it felt like it just worked. It made it strange, and it just once I did that, once I realized, oh, that's the key to this Bachelor material, is I'm not just showing clips from The Bachelor. They're slowed, they're made surreal in this way. Then the editing process started to just sort of fly, and then it became like a puzzle. Oh, here's a section where I'll cut together some images from these Sky Mall catalogs, and taking bits of dialogue from the independent film where maybe a character asks a question, and then cutting to what could be an answer to the question. And so I've never done this before, like described my own video to someone who hasn't seen it, but in doing so, I'm realizing, there was a thought process there, or there's a way that I really try to engage with the material itself. And so again, if a character is asking a question, can I try to answer that question? And then where does that take us? Oh, that takes us back to these clips from this 80s movie of a sort of co-ed bikini contest on a beach in Florida, and then where can I go from there? And eventually it gets to a point where there's the late stages of editing, it'll be like, okay, that section is done, and there's still it's not hitting my like emotional meters correctly yet. It's definitely it's like a puzzle coming together, and only I know how the pieces fit, and I don't know until they just fit, and I feel confident that I want to show it to other people. I don't know if that described the piece itself, because I do think it's maybe too like there's not a plot, there's not a clear narrative arc, but generally a sort of strange exploration of romantic tropes, and images, using The Bachelor, and using sort of mass market, media products as the material.
So, Ken, earlier you mentioned this idea of the ethics involved, in particular, in making dupes of these movies that have been sent to the company you're working for, and then using them in your work. But of course, all the material that you're working with is copyright protected, or at least presumptively copyright protected, and you're using it in a range of different ways that are not necessarily consistent with the wishes of the people who own a copyright interest in the work, whether or not they know that the work has been published and is generally available. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think about kind of the ethics or values or purposes writ large of the way you're working with media material, kind of as an artist.
There's definitely distinctions. There's differences in the way I think about different types of material. So, for instance, let's get to just, since I used Fantasy Suite as an example, I have no problem using clips from The Bachelor. Like I understand that, and this is less of an issue anymore. But there was a time when it felt like, oh well, if I use something that's connected, that is perceived or believed to be the intellectual property of a massive company, they could come after me. They could cease and desist. And I was never that worried about it. The worst that would happen is, okay, they make me take it off of YouTube. And in fact, Fantasy Suite, I don't think you can watch it on YouTube in Germany, because one of the films, that independent film I mentioned, that's in it, has a Roxette song, and somehow YouTube's algorithms caught that there's a Roxette song, and so I think it's blocked there. But anyways, that's a tangent. So I have no hesitation using that type of content. But if I felt like the ethics of using, say, the independent film were sort of dubious, it's partly because it's made by an independent filmmaker who's probably put a lot of his own finances into making this thing. As a cultural gatekeeper working for this company, I could instantly recognize, well, this is not going to be commercially viable for this company, and probably any commercial distributor, art house or otherwise. But it has value to me if I give myself the license to appropriate it and have it talk to and resonate with other work. So that is far from the intention of the filmmaker. But I do think about those people that I have never and probably will never meet. And I always try to approach the work in a spirit of generosity and not just making fun of the material itself. There are collectives and makers, like, everything is terrible. I like a lot of what they do. Their model is dumpster diving for fascinatingly bad or gory or whatever content from past eras, and now we know better than to think that this is good or funny or whatever it might be, or we laugh at it in a different way than how it was intended. And I can enjoy work made in that mode greatly, but what I'm doing is probably more of an essayist sort of approach. That sounds kind of pretentious, but I'm trying to engage with the material and find things in it that speak to me personally and that might offer the possibility of speaking to other people. And so, I've gotten great feedback from people who love that particular piece, because they feel like it is a sort of scathing critique of a certain type of heterosexual sort of uh, heterosexual romantic culture. And those might be people who identify as LGBTQ or they might be people like me who are basically like cisgendered people, but who don't really fit, or who want to be able to have relationships in which the kind of structures or the kind of like construction of relationships are different from a show like The Bachelor, or from the way that this movie might construct it. So, anyways, to get at your question, yeah, my practice is definitely, I'm wanting to sort of hold up a mirror to what gets made, to what kind of culture is produced through capitalism and through our sort of socially constructed sort of perceived shared values, and hold up a mirror to that, and then refract it and distort it through formal manipulation, or through bringing it in juxtaposition with other things that were never intended to speak with it. So if I ever feel queasy about the ethics of it, it tends to be if I'm using material that is itself sort of personal or intimate and is not made through corporate industrial processes. Does that make sense?
Of course, of course. So I'm wondering, in particular, sort of how you conceptualize the legitimacy or lack thereof of the desire to own and control forms of expression, specifically in relation not only to the material that you're using, but also to the material that you yourself create, right? Because of course there's a dialectic there, right?
Definitely, and this is not something I've ever really been able to settle, because we haven't talked about it too much, but at the same time that I was making these videos, including like the same month I was making Fantasy Suite, I've also had a somewhat separate practice of recording music, writing songs, conceiving of and constructing albums with other people, and excuse me, and that that content has very different aims, very different practices and techniques, and that content I do sort of. I don't like to think of it in terms of ownership, but I do put my name on it. And the videos, if any of your listeners watch these videos, you'll see every single one ends with this work is in the public domain. Part of that is a way for me to just like put it out there that I'm not copywriting this, because it's all taken from other sources, and also it's a gesture towards, well, what I'm interested in this question of what is the public domain. When I make music, I don't put that same tag on it. Some of that's because it's different type of content. I don't want a mega corporation to just like take a song of mine and make a bunch of money off of it. So I use Creative Commons licenses. Maybe at some point I'll just decide it's all free, do whatever you want with it. With the music, I would never object whatsoever if, say, someone recorded a cover without consulting me about it, or if someone sampled it. But I don't want my music to end up in a commercial or something, for cars or any sort of product. I don't want it to end up in a commercial in general, but I certainly don't want it to happen without, because I didn't. Because I just made it free for that sort of use. Maybe that's weak, or maybe that's hypocritical of me, but I've always thought of them as sort of different activities, different audiences, and sort of with different framing in terms of intellectual property. But with all of it, I don't feel like I own it, even the music. I don't feel like culture should be owned. I feel like once I put an album out, or once I release something, once I feel comfortable enough making it available to other people, if I decide I don't like a certain song, and that happens a lot, and I don't want to perform it anymore, I would never sort of argue with someone if that song meant something to them, because once it's out there, it belongs to other people. I don't know. I feel like you should challenge, or I feel like there are things I just said there that there's inconsistencies, and you should challenge me a little bit because I've never articulated it. I've never talked about the way that I sort of frame the music and how it differs from the way I frame the videos. And maybe I'm trying to like to have my cake and eat it too. I don't even know what that expression means, really.
Well, so one of the things I've always been interested in is your consistent practice of explicitly stating that the videos you make are in the public domain, because it's an interesting move in a number of different ways. For one thing, there's the question of, is it actually effective, right? Does a statement that a work is in the public domain actually make it so? Right. On another level, there's a kind of irony to say this is a work constructed out of bits and pieces of works that are protected by copyright. And I am performatively stating that this work that I appropriated, or maybe somebody might say misappropriated even, is now a public domain work. And part of me can't help but wonder if, to the extent that it sounds like you have some feelings of, I don't want to say regret, but feelings like, maybe on some occasions by copying and using material without the knowledge of the person who was sharing that material with a company on a confidential business basis, that maybe there was something arguably improper about the action. And I wonder if the sort of performative statement of placing it in the public domain, or stating that you place it in the public domain, and in a sense sort of performatively renounce your own ownership of the material that you've worked on, is also kind of a way of reaching for a certain kind of absolution in relation to those possible misgivings.
That's a great way to put it. I think, yeah, I think I would say that's generous to think of it that way. I think I guess I've always felt like it's messy, but I believe and am committed to, and I think it's just happening before our eyes in some ways that are sort of monstrous, but I'm committed to culture being this just messy place in which something that is intended for one purpose can just be spun around, and maybe something that is in its original form grotesque or just really misguided. What if you slow it down, or what if you take one moment from it and cut it together with something different? Could that make someone weep? Could that be deeply moving, or could that be really funny? Could that provide catharsis? And I think maybe there's a critique of production, like all of this. There's all of this stuff that gets made and money gets spent on it, and people work really hard on it, and only a tiny fraction of it actually makes it into onto Netflix or into a theater. And a lot of what I'm saying right now applies a little bit more to when I was making a lot of this work, when there was more scarcity. You didn't have YouTube, you didn't have just everyone uploading their own channel of their art. But so I have to acknowledge that this practice has really changed a lot as the technology of making and sharing media has changed. But so really, what in a lot of ways what I was kind of hoping for when I made this work and put the public domain sort of credit at the end, was this sense of, let's not be so precious about all this stuff. Like, and for me, it's just incredibly fulfilling to do this, to take things that feel like they're discarded or that might never be seen outside of the sort of maker's immediate friends and family, and share them with my own friends or my own peers in a small community that is sort of like maybe a bit trained or has a desire or understands the tradition of appropriation, understands that it's a huge part of just contemporary art making in general. I don't know if that gets at the question effectively, but
Yeah, no, I mean, so I wonder, like as a member of a particular discursive community, right, of largely video and film artists working in a sort of art world adjacent, at least, setting, right? I mean, this is a area of production in which, at least in my experience, the majority of authors seem very intent on exercising control, on being concerned about ownership and attribution, and on sort of expressing something very personal about themselves and their own values through the work that they're creating, that they want to sort of maintain control over and be able to manage the way it's presented and maybe even the way it's kind of discussed and understood. And so it's interesting to me that you're presenting your work in a way that that historically, especially, and I think that it's still to some degree true today, even as social media distribution and so on has become so much more common, people still want to have certain kinds of control and ownership. And in a sense, you're sort of renouncing some of that control. And I wonder sort of how you think about that dichotomy in terms of your own practice and also in terms of how you see the practice of other artists working in the same space.
Well, I would say, the way you described artists working, the sort of general mode of making that artists sort of want to have a certain degree of control. Like everything you said, I identify with that. I put my name on this work. I submit it to festivals, and I want it to be a representation of the way that I look at the world. I don't want someone else to take discarded media and edit together and put my name on it and have it be sloppy or have it be, material, just have it say something different. So I'm very much trying to express myself and unpack or, reflect on things that are of concern to me. So, I'll just keep using Fantasy Suite as the example. Like, having collected this material, there was definitely an itch to just like work something out about like maybe it's about my own life and being married and being in, in a lot of ways a traditional sort of heterosexual relationship, and just sort of chafing at a lot of the ways in which family structures or culture sort of put boxes around that, and so wanting to just deal with it. And so I want that work to I want my name to be attached to it. What might be a little bit different is I don't necessarily want to make money from it. I don't want to control how many people can see it, and that maybe there is an art world mode in which a gallery represents something, and so it can only be seen in certain spaces, certain sanctioned spaces. And I think that I was thrilled as soon as I could have a YouTube account, a Vimeo account, and just make things available widely. Without having to have these sort of gatekeepers in between necessarily. So I don't think that I'm that far apart from other peers in that space, maybe other than the fact that I'm not interested, in the case of these videos, in doing whatever putting a copyright symbol on a piece does for the maker. Do you know what I mean? Like, if somebody wants to chop up any of my videos and make a remix, that would be somewhat weird in that they'd just be chopping up something that's consists of already chopped up other things, but I would be thrilled about that. And maybe that's one of the differences. I think maybe film and video makers who are making really personal work in which sort of every shot is carefully composed and lit, maybe they wouldn't appreciate someone, riffing on or somehow taking that and showing it in a less high definition format or something. So, but otherwise, everything you said about the way sort of artists want to sort of, I'm obsessive about this work, and I don't let people see it until I feel like every moment is like kind of finely honed and just feels right to me. I will obsess and obsess in the final stages of editing because there might just be some 2-second shot that's a little too long, or that needs to be stretched out a little bit, or there might be one sound that's like a little too jarring that needs to be smoothed out. So to me, that's like about control. I think you were talking about control in a slightly different way, but um, I I am not making work that's meant to be sort of seen as anonymous or something. It's very much about what I'm concerned with, and I've thought about the music that I make and the videos that I make as being really different. But the older I get and the longer I do this, I realize actually the main difference is just the social and sort of economic, the sort of business communities that and structures that I have to sort of get them out to other people. If you want to make music and get it to an audience beyond just your friends, you have to engage with labels. And then making these kind of videos, it's more like festivals and maybe very, very small distributors. Other than that, I think I am working in, when I write songs, it's completely by myself, and I flesh the music out with other people in many cases. When I'm making videos, it's pretty much completely by myself. So that's a difference. But in general, I guess I'm not trying to get famous. I really try to keep my ego in check and make work that, an underlying motivation is to do something that is meaningful to other people, that might provide some sort of catharsis for them. So I generally, with both music and video, I don't want to make a really literal statement about anything. I'm more want to ask questions of myself. I want to critique my own consumption habits, my own, I want to critique my own ways of engaging. Like, why do I end up watching certain TV shows? Why did I get hooked on 24 during the Iraq War? I don't know. So I worked it out. I used clips from 24 and Lost in a video because I felt kind of uncomfortable and ambivalent about consuming those shows. So I don't know. I guess if does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, for sure, for sure. So in addition to the collage work that you've described, you've also done a fair amount of video work that sort of falls into a category that often known as like machinima effect. Right? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that work is like and how it relates to your other work. Do you see it as having similar goals, or are you trying to accomplish different things in that work? And how do you see it kind of fitting within that genre in relation to the kinds of things other people are doing kind of in the same space?
Okay. So yes, in recent years, maybe since about 2012, I have been working on a series of videos that are focused on video games. I feel like it's a continuation of the past work in that I'm not going out with a camera and hiring actors or anything like that. And I'm making work, almost completely from material that is, corporate intellectual property, but in this case it's video games. And so it's different in that as a player of a video game, one has a certain amount of agency and control over what appears. And so especially with current console and PC gaming, you can control the camera, and you can do all sorts of things to manipulate the image just within the game, depending on how it's been constructed. So in that way, I suppose it's different. I'm not just taking some tape that I found and cutting it up with something else. I'm participating in a different way, and also it has a different focus. I might be interested in saying things about misogyny or all sorts of political topics through games in the ways that with the past work I would maybe try to talk about war or sort of warmongering and the culture of the Bush-Cheney era. I wouldn't speak about it directly in those days, but I would try to use other material to sort of try to form some sort of reflection of the sort of political, socio-political culture of the time. In this case, I'm using video games maybe towards similar ends. But it is definitely work that falls into this tradition of machinima. The first time I was introduced to that term, the work that I saw as representative of it was sort of like using video games to make cinema in a sort of mainstream way. So like having characters pose and then having dialogue and maybe having the dialogue dubbed over it. And I'm not engaging with that. I mean, if I don't have any problem calling it machinima, but I think of it as very much sort of experimental or avant-garde machinima in that I'm not interested in like making movies out of video games. I'm interested in making this sort of reflective, hopefully poetic sort of work, and video games just are the material that I'm concerned with, and I'm interested in talking about what it means that they're this at least commercially dominant form now, and I think for a lot of young people they're as important to them as movies were to me as a kid in the 90s. So yeah, the way the work is operating, I think it looks different in that I'm using mostly sort of HD sources, and so it doesn't have this sort of kind of retro
Recording.
lo-fi feeling that a lot of my early videos had. But I do see it as a continuation, and I'm trying to challenge myself to use different formal strategies. So a piece I finished about 3 years ago called Reckoning 4. I tried to sort of step up a little bit and do things like one of the underlying kind of formal techniques in that work was I would play video games, and find scenes in them in which there were TVs or computer screens, and then maybe sort of set up a shot in which there's a screen, and then take other video clips and put them on those screens. So, use compositing techniques to sort of make it look like, oh, in the video game, this character, or in this sort of control center, the thing that's playing on the TV is this movie that then we cut to. And so you as the audience of my work will then see this other piece. And so sort of moving between different source material through this device of having screens in video games that are showing different work, and using audio the same way. So finding a game in which there's a radio and then constructing my piece so that what's being heard from the radio is a podcast in which people are talking about misogyny in gaming culture or something like that. So probably the work feels really different, and I hope it does, because I didn't want to just continue to make work that was about, oh, let's all laugh at this crazy tape that Kent found, but making work that I think one goal currently is to more directly engage with my own consumption of culture. And so I enjoy video games recreationally, but I'm not completely comfortable with that. There's a lot about them and about the culture around them that's very troubling to me. And so making work from them is a way to sort of resolve that a bit, or at least to, I can feel a little more comfortable engaging with video games if I'm not completely doing so as a consumer or as a fan.
Well, so in closing, Ken, I mean, it does seem to me that there's a way in which there's a kind of mainstreaming of the sort of machinima format, as well as sort of a intentional kind of encouragement or even collaboration on the part of the people producing the video games that sort of implicitly, or in some cases it seems like even explicitly, encourage their users to engage in this kind of engagement with, or in this kind of use of the product. And I wonder if that in any way changed or affected the way you thought about your relationship to the material that you were using, and the nature of the sort of engagement with the product in relation to the the kinds of ideas around ownership, recreation, and expression that you were engaged with in your previous work?
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit I haven't done any kind of deep dive into the kind of machinima you just described that might be a little bit more sort of blessed by the game companies, or the kind of things that they may want to see, where it's like, oh, here's a player who's showing how beautiful this scene we created is. I mean, there's a possibility of finding that in some of the work I'm making now, but if there's a kind of prankster energy that I'm trying to summon in many cases, and I'm definitely trying to critique this stuff that I enjoy. I'm trying to critique these products that just have tremendous, just the amount of people that it takes to make this work, and probably there's a lot of dark stories that are rarely told or that I haven't yet explored about the labor structures, to just create these scenes. And so to give an example, in a piece I made that I put out in 2014, I had this this UFC fighting game, and I tried to play the tutorial. I didn't really intend to play that game and become good at it, but I was just another thing to put in the mix, to put in to upload into my editing software. And in playing this game and playing the tutorial, it was so complicated. The moves, you had to do this button press and then turn this controller this way. And I'm not that good at I'm not that good at playing games. And so I realized no matter what I did, these two characters, these two avatars, these fighters who were very photorealistic, they would end up sort of dry humping, these two men. And clearly the game was not intended. At least I don't think so. And if it was, great. But the purpose of the tutorial was just to help me learn how to play the game, and then I can go on and level up and maybe play against other people online through my prowess of these coordinated button presses. But by playing it in a bumbling way, I ended up being able to create and sort of capture this very sort of homoerotic cinema, so to speak. And so that's how I'm trying in this practice. There are times when I just play a game to let off steam for an hour before I go to bed. But when I'm intentionally playing with the prospect of it being part of my video work, I will, in many cases, try to play the game absolutely in a way it's not intended to be played. If there's a scene in which there's some dialogue and then you're supposed to just move along to the next cut scene and then an action sequence comes after that where you shoot a bunch of people, I will just draw that out and I will try not to go to the next scene and produce sort of awkward action between the characters. And so I don't think that's the type of machinima that the game companies want people to make, although I think that I perhaps am still playing into their sort of schemes because I'm still showcasing. And I do get questions sometimes like, what was that game in that scene? But I'm throwing so many in there, and I'm sort of intentionally trying to obscure maybe the original texts. But that said, I'm not trying to say that this work is sort of superior to the work of somebody who just plays a game and wants to make a beautiful little movie out of it. It's just different. It's in a different sphere, and it's not something I invented. There's a tradition of this as well with artists like Phil Solomon and Peggy Awesh and all kinds of other people, Corey Archangel, who would play games and then just try to take capture from them and then present that in this sort of art world or experimental cinema context. I feel like there was another facet to your question that I have forgotten, or do you feel like that answered it in a remotely satisfying way?
No, that was absolutely
Okay.
great. So thanks so much, Kent, for coming on the show. It was really fun and interesting to talk to you about how a video artist thinks about ownership and copyright and so many of the things that we are studying as law professors and you are operationalizing as the person who's actually engaging in cultural production.
Well, it was great to talk to you about this. In parting, let's say there's some students out there who are students of the law, but also interested in this type of culture. I'm just going to name check a couple of other things that were very influential to me. The Tape Beatles and Negative Land were making a lot of work in the late 90s that was really crucial to me. And I would encourage anyone listening to this, if you don't already know about the Negative Land single called U2, and the fair use law case that resulted from it, I highly encourage you to seek that out. Because we didn't talk about fair use, but all of this video work we're talking about, some of the confidence that I've had in making it and not really giving a shit about, whose property this material is coming from the fact that people like Negative Land had done the work of sort of arguing that if we take clips from a radio show and use MIDI versions of a U2 song and put it out as a vinyl record with the letter U and the numeral 2 on the front, that's fair use. We're not somehow damaging U2 or we're not somehow stealing from them. It's a legitimate work in its own right. That was a major influence on me in proceeding with the kind of work I just talked about.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Kent. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. And I look forward to now listening to your podcast regularly.
I saw your mom at the party after Esther She was just sort of standing around. I met your sister Summer. Actually, I just kind of said hi. I told her she was great in the film. She said thanks and smiled. She seemed really nice. River Phoenix, forget the metaphors. I wonder what you would have thought of your brother walking in Gladiator. I thought that he was really good and that the movie was okay. You know, I felt the same way about you and little Nikita in 1988. Your mom looked so much like you both had the same eyes. I wanted to give her a hug and ask for girlfriend advice. Michael Stipe was at the party, and so was Gus Van Sant. Someone said that Summer was dating Casey Affleck. I said at least she's not with Ben. River Phoenix, if you were still alive, would you hang out with them? used to like drugs too. In fact, I kind of still do. But I couldn't afford the ones that you used. The fan site talks like you are an angel. At times even like you are Jesus. Why don't you come on down and see us? Show us that